when authorities stepped into a farmhouse buried deep within the Appalachian hills and found a family that should not have existed. Every face inside looked the same. Dozens of them, pale, silent, identical. For nearly 100 years, no one in the outside world knew this family even existed. They called themselves the Chosen. This wasn't a cult or a commune. It was one family, sealed away in a forgotten homestead, surviving generation after generation, born only from their own blood. How does a bloodline stay hidden that long, with no contact with the outside world? And what drove them to believe they were chosen for something far greater than the world itself? Tonight, we open the case of the Wellers, a lineage erased from history until the day it was found. Welcome to X Archives. Before we begin, write the time and location you're watching from in the comments below. It helps us see how far these stories still reach. And if you're new here, subscribe and like this video to support real investigative storytelling. Because what happened in that valley wasn't just isolation. It was the erasure of a family line. A century of devotion turned into something no one was ever meant to see. In the spring of 1957, Sheriff Edgar Tully and two deputies followed a dirt road that had not been used in years. The trail wound through the valley in narrow switchbacks, overgrown and half-swallowed by brush. Reports of silence had come from the far end of the county, mail uncollected, no smoke from chimneys, livestock gone feral. The Weller homestead had always kept to itself, but this time there had been nothing for weeks. When the men reached the clearing, they found the farmhouse intact, yet lifeless. Its windows were sealed with mismatched boards nailed from the inside. A pale dust coated everything, as if the place had been abandoned and inhabited at once. Tully called out twice, received no reply, and forced the door open with a shoulder. The air inside was stagnant and heavy with age. The deputies' lanterns caught movement, not one figure, but many. They stood together in the shadows, motionless, watching. Dozens of people filled the main room, men, women, and children, all bearing the same narrow faces and gray-green eyes. None spoke when questioned. When the light fell across them, their features appeared so alike that they seemed reflections rather than relatives. Tully's report would later state that every visible person answered to the same surname. No clear family structure could be identified. No parents or children distinguished. The youngest clung to the eldest with identical gestures, as if mimicry had replaced relation. Every document found within the home was signed Weller. In the adjoining rooms, the deputies discovered more evidence of confinement. Doors opened into chambers without windows. Furniture was handmade, uniform, each piece built from the same rough timber. On the walls, faded markings repeated the same initials over and over, carved deep into the grain. Bones, animal and human, were sorted in boxes, tagged with approximate years written in ink that had bled across the paper. Upstairs, a trunk contained journals wrapped in cloth. The earliest entries dated back nearly a century, written in the same measured handwriting. Later volumes, scrawled by different hands, grew increasingly fragmented, the script collapsing into symbols and repeating words. The entries charted births, deaths, and pairings, but no mention of anyone outside the household appeared after 1870. By dusk, the sheriff had secured the property and radioed for state assistance. His official statement described the site as a self-contained community with no external lineage. The medical examiner would later confirm that every living person on the premises carried distinct but shared genetic anomalies, the product of generations without new ancestry. As darkness settled over the valley, Tully stood on the porch and looked out toward the tree line. The path behind him led back to civilization. The one ahead, into a history no one had chosen to see. What he had found in that house was not a crime scene or a commune. It was the end of a long experiment, one that had begun quietly when a single pair of siblings turned their backs on the world and never returned. The story of the Wellers begins long before the farmhouse in the valley, in the hills of rural Kentucky. 1860, Abram and Miriam Weller were twins, born to a family of tenant farmers who owned little more than a few acres of exhausted soil. When sickness took both parents within a single winter, the twins were left alone at 16, inheriting nothing but the small cabin their father had built and a family Bible worn thin from use. Neighbors remembered them as polite but detached. They rarely joined church gatherings or markets, and when they did, they stood apart, speaking only to each other in low tones. Abram showed a quiet intelligence, reading scripture with an intensity that unsettled others. Miriam followed his lead in most things, trusting his interpretations more than the local preachers. Within a few years, people in the nearby town began calling them the twins who married themselves to God. As the war years passed, Abram's beliefs hardened. He saw the chaos around him, disease, hunger, conscription, as proof that the outside world had strayed from divine order. In his journals from that time, the first to survive, he wrote of corruption in the blood and families mixing their errors together until nothing remains clean. His notes weren't the ramblings of a fanatic yet, but the language of separation had begun. By their early 20s, the twins had sold what remained of the family's land and purchased a small parcel deep in the forested hills to the south. Records show the sale date, 1867, followed by no further public transactions under their names. The trail of paperwork ends there, as if they simply vanished into the landscape. The land they chose was difficult terrain, steep ridges, poor soil, a narrow creek running through limestone. They built a cabin by hand, adding to it room by room over the years. Supplies were carted in from town only during the first few months. Afterward, Abram refused further trade. He began growing corn and keeping goats, documenting each yield in neat columns of ink. The journals of that period describe a man methodically removing every dependency beyond his own boundary. Miriam's letters, found later among their belongings, reveal a quieter conviction. She wrote of peace, of the comfort of work without interruption, of a stillness that feels like obedience. Yet, beneath her words lies fatigue, a woman following her brother's certainty even when it led further inward. By 1872, no one in town had seen either twin for more than 3 years. Hunters passing through reported smoke in the valley, then nothing at all. The last entry from Abram's early journals reads, "We are safe from contagion. Our faith will remain unsullied if our line remains our own." That conviction became foundation and sentence. What began as devotion turned into creed, and creed into blueprint. The Wellers' new home, a patchwork cabin built against the slope of the hills, would endure for nearly a century. It was meant to be sanctuary, but in time, it became something else entirely. A world sealed by its own design, untouched by every life beyond it. By the mid-1870s, the Weller homestead had grown from a single-room cabin into a narrow, uneven structure that crept along the hillside. Abram Weller recorded every modification in his ledger: timber cut, nails used, number of hands employed. There were only 2 hands, his own and his sister's. Each addition to the house mirrored the expanding shape of their life together, both orderly and unnatural. Abram's journals from that decade read more like field notes than private reflection. He documented harvest yields, rainfall, animal births, and, after a time, human ones. Miriam delivered her first child in the winter of 1875. It lived 3 days. The next survived, and Abram marked the event with a simple line of ink: second born, steady breath, strong eyes. Over the next 10 years, Miriam bore several more. Some were buried near the creek. Others reached adulthood. Each was listed, weighed, measured, and categorized with the same precision he applied to crops. As his family grew, so did the records. Entire pages were devoted to describing features that repeated from parent to child. Gray-green eyes, narrow jaws, a shared curvature of the spine. Abram interpreted these similarities not as chance but as confirmation. In one entry written in 1882, he noted that "our likeness is preserved." The phrase appeared again in later pages, replacing earlier references to faith or providence. The vocabulary of religion gave way to that of lineage, and devotion transformed into method. The household operated as a closed unit. Abram built a small mill beside the creek and taught the older children to grind corn. He kept ledgers of seeds saved and medicine made from roots. No outside assistance was permitted. Education came from the family Bible and from Abram's own writings, copied by the children as daily exercise. The boundary between instruction and doctrine vanished. Neighbors who still lived within a day's walk ceased visiting. Those who once tried to help were turned away politely, then firmly. The Wellers had food enough, tools enough, and no use for trade. They began making their own garments from flax and hide, sewing identical shapes and sizes until distinction among them blurred. Visitors later described the clothing as uniform, the people interchangeable. By the late 1880s, Abram's entries had taken on the tone of command. His handwriting, once careful, grew cramped and forceful. Margins filled with calculations, ratios of births to deaths, notes on physical deviations. Each generation was numbered rather than named. Children who failed to thrive were crossed out with a single line, as though they were failed experiments. The last entry of that period concludes without flourish. We will endure by remaining whole. Purity maintained. In his view, the outside world carried disease, temptation, dilution. Within his walls, order and sameness reigned. From that conviction, a new rule took hold. One that turned a family into an inheritance of itself. The Wellers would not seek others. They would become their own continuation, and the world beyond their fence would, from that day forward, cease to exist. When Abram Weller died in the winter of 1891, his journals ended abruptly. The final entry, a half-finished line about frost killing the last of the corn. The handwriting stopped mid-stroke. It was Silas, his eldest son, who took up the book afterward, though what he wrote no longer resembled words. Silas had been raised in his father's image. From an early age, he copied Abram's ledgers and recited the same verses until they became reflex rather than belief. He learned to measure everything: harvest weight, rainfall, the size of each child's skull. But his understanding of why faded with time. Where Abram had been deliberate, Silas was instinctive. His authority came not from doctrine but inheritance, and obedience was no longer taught. It was expected. After Abram's death, Miriam's presence diminished. She moved into the small room near the back of the house and was seldom mentioned again in the surviving records. The family structure shifted. Leadership became generational rather than parental. Silas, now head of the household, redefined the rules his father had written. Pairings among kin continued, but the practice took on ceremony. Meals arranged in silence, births recorded by mark rather than name. The writing changed too. Ink gave way to charcoal, words to shapes. Early symbols were simple, circles and lines marking the order of birth, but later pages became dense, nearly abstract. The meaning of these signs remains uncertain. Some repeated patterns resemble constellations, others branching trees. To the Wellers, they may have represented continuity, or perhaps a private alphabet of inheritance. Physical changes appeared in the same years the written language began to vanish. The family's faces grew narrower, limbs thinner. The uniformity Abram once celebrated deepened into deformity. Slanted jaws, uneven gait, and pale eyes that never seemed to fix on anything for long. Yet inside the household, these features were regarded not as defects but as confirmation that their likeness was preserved. Visitors were no longer part of their reality. A census taker came once in 1900 and was told there were no Wellers living on the property. A second attempt, 5 years later, found the house abandoned, its doors nailed shut, but smoke still rising from the chimney. After that, no official record mentions the family again. Inside, Silas continued to expand the dwelling his father built. New rooms were added without logic, narrow corridors leading nowhere, stairways ending in blank walls. It was less a home than a structure growing by instinct, mirroring the lineage it sheltered. By the time Silas's own children reached adulthood, names had disappeared entirely. Generations blurred into a single repetition of gestures and tasks. They farmed, they bred, they recorded, and they prayed to no one in particular. Outside the valley, their absence became a rumor, then a memory, and finally, nothing at all. What Abram began as an experiment of faith had hardened under Silas into a system without meaning. The Wellers no longer spoke of purpose. They simply endured. And by the turn of the century, endurance itself had become their only form of belief. In the early spring of 1912, a fur trapper named Thomas Vail set out through the southern ridge of the Kentucky highlands, following the creek that cut deep into the valley. The region had long since been written off on county maps, the roads unkept and the settlements forgotten. Vail was not a man of superstition, but he noted early on that the woods felt oddly arranged, quiet, symmetrical, as though tended by unseen hands. 2 days into his route, he found traces of habitation, a fence line half swallowed by vines, an iron kettle blackened from recent fire, and prints in the mud, small, bare, and numerous. The trail led him deeper into the hollow where the trees pressed close and the light thinned. Around dusk he heard voices. Not words, but a patterned noise, rhythmic clicking like pebbles struck together in deliberate sequence. Vale followed the sound until he reached a clearing. There, through the trees, he saw figures, a dozen or more, standing among the trunks in a perfect semicircle. They were motionless, pale against the dark wood, all with the same narrow faces. The reflection of his lantern caught their eyes, grey-green, shining back in unison. For a moment, he thought he was looking at a single face multiplied. He retreated, careful not to run, and did not stop until he reached open ground. Later he told a tavern owner in a nearby town what he'd seen. A silent community that moved without speaking, that watched him but did not follow. His story was recorded by the local constable, who dismissed it as drunken fantasy. The report filed that night noted only encounter with transient squatters, no action taken. Back in the valley, the disturbance did not go unnoticed. Silas Weller, now an old man, had grown wary of intrusion. He ordered the outer boundary reinforced, new fences built from fallen timber, traps set along the creek, paths erased underbrush. The surviving records show a flurry of activity in those months. Markings repainted, walls repaired, and strange signs hung from trees near the property edge. Some were carved wooden discs bearing concentric circles. Others were bundles of bones tied with reeds. Their purpose is unclear, but they appeared suddenly after Vale's intrusion and were never mentioned before. The journals from that period are brief and uneven. Words give way to scratches, then to the same circular symbols Vale later described. There is one line that remains legible. The eyes have been seen. The door must be sealed. For the first time in decades, the Wellers knew that someone beyond their walls had looked in. The response was not curiosity but defense. What little order Silas maintained turned to suspicion. The sense that the outer world was no longer distant but waiting. When Vale returned to town weeks later, he refused to speak of the valley again. The locals stopped asking. The Wellers, now ghosts on the edge of the map, drew tighter around themselves. By winter, the fences had doubled, the paths disappeared entirely, and whatever sunlight once reached their clearing had been shut out for good. By the turn of the century, the Weller compound had become a structure without logic, a network of rooms that bent and overlapped, like a body grown beyond its frame. Walls were added to walls, corridors turned back into themselves, and doors opened into spaces too small for use. What had begun as Abram's cabin was now a maze of timber and stone, built by hands that followed memory rather than plan. Each addition was made to accommodate another birth, another branch of the same unbroken stem. By this time, no one living inside had seen the world beyond the ridgeline. The family had been contained for so long that the concept of an outside place no longer existed in their understanding. The journals, or what remained of them, reflect this shift. Names disappear entirely, births and deaths are marked. Only by symbols, the same looping shapes drawn again and again. Language had thinned until it no longer held sentences, only sounds repeated between them like echoes. Visitors who would one day study the recovered notes described them as an attempt at writing by those who had forgotten what writing was. Marks appear rhythmic, not random, as if drawn in coordination. It is believed that communication within the household had broken down into shared gestures and synchronized noises. Observers later compared the pattern to a kind of private code, mechanical, stripped of nuance, passed from one generation to the next like inheritance. Within the compound, daily existence continued according to routine rather than understanding. The Wellers farmed small plots behind the house, raised thin livestock, and repaired the structure endlessly. Everything was done collectively, movements mirrored from one person to another. There was no evidence of hierarchy or leadership, only habit. The individuality that had once distinguished Abram from Silas, or either from Miriam, had dissolved completely. Every remaining Weller answered to the same name, and performed the same tasks until even the idea of difference seemed to have disappeared. The physical changes that had begun decades earlier became more pronounced. Children were born smaller, bone structures increasingly fragile. eyes pale enough to appear translucent in low light. Yet these features drew no comment in the surviving records. What would have seemed deformity elsewhere had become ordinary, even ideal. The Wellers were now their own measure of normality. Among the last artifacts found in the compound was a ledger attributed to Silas Weller. Its early pages still legible. The entries grow erratic toward the end, lines cutting across one another, numbers without context. The final page carries a series of incomplete drawings, circles nested within circles, and one unfinished sentence in a trembling hand. They are still, and we are the same. The pen trailed off midway through the final word. After that point, no further written record exists. The house continued to grow, the family continued to multiply, but whatever form of language they once held, spoken, written, or understood, slipped away completely. The silence that followed was not absence, but inheritance, carried forward like everything else in their blood. By the second decade of the 20th century, the Weller family was nearing the end of its capacity to sustain itself. Records recovered from the property indicate a dramatic rise in infant deaths beginning around 1914. Of 16 recorded births between that year and 1922, only 3 survived beyond infancy. Most were described in brief notes as not breathing, small, or simply marked with a cross. The family had no access to medicine, no outside contact, and the soil around the compound had long since lost fertility. As food diminished, their routines shifted from cultivation to scavenging. They hunted small animals, stripped bark from trees, and foraged roots along the creek. Remnants of crude traps were later found near the perimeter, evidence of an effort to catch whatever still moved in the woods. The livestock that Abram once kept had vanished generations earlier. Survival no longer followed pattern or ritual. It had become reflex. The physical toll was severe. Surviving skeletal remains show stunted growth, brittle bone structure, and advanced signs of malnutrition. Among adults, the most common markers were curvature of the spine, fused joints, and deformities of the skull consistent across generations. Their eyesight likely weakened with each descent, though the family adapted by moving mostly within the dark interior of the house. Windows had been boarded for so long that natural light scarcely entered. Burial customs, once formal and recorded, disappeared entirely. Excavations decades later revealed that human bones had been reused throughout the structure, some as reinforcement in walls, others fashioned into tools or ornaments. Anthropologists would later note the uniformity of these objects, suggesting not reverence but practicality. Death had become as integrated into their existence as birth. Leadership, too, had dissolved. There are no indications of a central figure after Silas Weller's death. Decision-making seems to have shifted to collective behavior, the group moving, eating, and working as a single organism. Individual preference or authority had ceased to exist. By the 1920s, their actions appear to have been guided by memory alone, the repetition of inherited motions with no clear understanding of purpose. The last legible entry in the surviving records dates roughly to that period. Written in a smaller hand, perhaps by one of Silas's descendants, it reads only, "The first voice returns." Its meaning remains uncertain. Some researchers interpret it as a reference to the family's earliest language, others as a symbolic description of collapse, the voice being the first and final echo of consciousness before extinction. After that note, documentation ends. There are no signs of correspondence, no mention in county files, no sightings from neighboring communities. The Wellers had withdrawn completely into the structure they had built, a closed system sustained only by habit. By the early 1930s, the family had reduced itself to a biological minimum. A few surviving members living in darkness, feeding off the land and each other's endurance. Faith, record, and identity were gone. What remained was movement without thought, preservation without intent. The Wellers no longer lived as people bound by lineage. They persisted as instinct, breathing remnants of a name that had forgotten its own origin. In the summer of 1936, a geological survey crew was dispatched by the state to chart mineral seams across the southern range of Kentucky. Their assignment was routine: to mark potential coal deposits and note water tables for future development. The men carried instruments, maps, and no expectation of finding anything beyond the standard ridges and hollows. Midway through the third week of the expedition, they reached a section of valley left blank on the topographical chart, an area listed only as private tract, unrecorded. The land showed signs of having once been cleared, though the growth had since reclaimed it. From a rise above the tree line, one of the surveyors spotted faint columns of smoke drifting through the canopy. At first, they assumed it was the remnants of a lightning fire. But when they descended toward the creek, they discovered the smoke held steady, rising from a fixed point. Approaching closer, they found traces of human habitation, a path overrun by moss, the remains of a fence, and scattered tools rusted nearly to dust. Then, near the edge of a clearing, movement. Several figures standing still among the trees. The men later disagreed on the number, some recalling 4, others more. What they shared was the same impression. The watchers did not speak, wave, or retreat. They simply remained half-concealed by shadow, observing. The crew left after less than an hour, unsettled but unwilling to abandon their task entirely. That evening, they filed a short report describing inhabited structures of unknown origin and possible residents avoiding contact. The document reached the county office but went no further. Officials annotated the margin with a single note: likely squatters or distillers. No follow-up was authorized. The survey continued in other directions, and within days the valley was forgotten. Yet the brief entry in their field log would later match the location of the Weller homestead precisely. For the first time in decades, outside eyes had glimpsed the settlement. Nothing in the report hinted at the true scale of what remained within. Only smoke, stillness, and the suggestion of life where none was expected. Back in the hollow, the presence of strangers did not go unnoticed. Scattered notes from later excavations show evidence of rapid repair around that time. New boards over windows, fresh soil piled along boundary fences. Within months, traces of smoke vanished again from aerial records. The Wellers had withdrawn further inward, the encounter reawakening the old fear passed down through generations, that discovery was punishment and visibility a threat. When survey crews returned to the region 10 years later, the valley was marked as unsuitable terrain and excluded from mapping. The prior incident was never mentioned in official correspondence. Whatever had stirred the attention of the outside world in 1936 dissolved quietly back into omission. The forest reclaimed its boundary, and the smoke that once betrayed their existence faded from every chart. The Wellers, unseen once more, returned to the only safety they had ever known, remaining where no one cared to look. In the autumn of 1949, Clara Finch, aged 24, left her home in Louisville to search for her missing sister Nora, who had disappeared while traveling through the Southern Highlands. The official record describes Nora as last seen boarding a bus bound for the town of Redford. She never arrived. When local authorities offered little assistance, Clara began her own search, tracing her sister's route through the neglected valleys that bordered the county line. After 3 days following the creek road, she entered a stretch of wilderness unmarked on any map. Her notes later recovered described the landscape as too still, too symmetrical, as if the forest had been shaped to hide something beneath it. Toward dusk, she saw a clearing, a cluster of buildings built from rough timber, their walls patched with rusted metal and moss. Smoke rose weakly from one chimney. Believing she had found an abandoned homestead, Clara approached. Inside the first structure, she found evidence of long habitation: crude furniture fashioned from branches, jars sealed with wax. A series of shallow pits dug into the floor where fires had once burned. In a corner stood a shelf lined with journals, the earliest dated in the 19th century. The pages were brittle, filled with looping shapes rather than sentences. A few entries in older handwriting appeared in English, but soon devolved into repetition of the same fragmented symbols. Among the later volumes she found drawings, faces with identical features, children arranged in circular patterns, and diagrams of the house itself. That night, she camped inside the main room, lighting a small fire for warmth. In her field notes she wrote of hearing footsteps beyond the doorway and soft knocks answered by more of the same, as if in communication. At dawn, she saw figures standing at the edge of the clearing, thin, pale, all watching her without expression. They did not advance or retreat. When she waved, they lifted their hands in the same motion. When she stepped backward, they mirrored it. Her account describes this mimicry continuing for several minutes, without sound, until she fled into the woods. Clara remained in the valley for nearly 2 days, attempting to find her way out. Her final journal entry reads, "They do not chase, but they wait. They repeat what they see. It is not curiosity, it is memory." The entry ends abruptly mid-sentence. She was later found near the county road by a passing driver, disoriented and unable to explain where she had been. Among her belongings recovered weeks later were her damaged notebook, fragments of clothing, and several pages torn from one of the Weller journals. When local officers investigated, they found the clearing as she described, but no inhabitants. The houses stood empty, the fires long cold. Human remains were discovered in the lower levels of one structure, unburied, aged beyond recognition. Of Nora Finch there was no trace. Clara's notes were archived by the county under unverified encounter, then forgotten. The following year, the property was struck from official maps, erased again by silence. Only the journals remained, marking the last known point of contact between the world outside and what was left of the Weller line. By the middle of the 1950s, the Weller compound was no longer a home, but a ruin inhabited by what remained of a lineage that had sustained itself for nearly a century. The records recovered from the site show no births after 1953. Of the few adults still alive, most were infirm, thin, unsteady, and visibly marked by years of deprivation. Disease and hunger had become constants. The wells had long since gone stagnant, and the surrounding soil, stripped bare, could no longer yield crops. What food remained came from scavenging and desperation. Structural decay matched their physical decline. Roof beams had splintered under their own weight, floors caved into the cellars below, and the connecting passages that once linked each addition to the next had collapsed. The house that had grown through generations was folding back upon itself. The survivors occupied only a few intact rooms near the center, surrounded by rot and silence. When investigators later entered the property, they found crude barricades fashioned from broken furniture. A final attempt to seal the inner chambers from whatever remained outside. The bodies discovered inside told a uniform story. Most were clustered together in the lower levels, skeletal remains intertwined as if they had gathered for warmth or shared confinement. Others lay alone in corners, their placement deliberate rather than chaotic. The absence of struggle marks suggested a slow collective death, not a violent one. Whether starvation or deliberate withdrawal, no one could say. The surviving journals contained no explanation, only disjointed sketches of circles and lines. The last legible entry read simply, "The last day comes quietly." Of the few who were still living when Sheriff Edgar Tully's team arrived, none were capable of speech. They were found crouched together in the main room, reacting to light and movement, but offering no sound. Each bore the same gray-green eyes that had been recorded in earlier generations. Medical examiners noted severe malnutrition, congenital deformities, and near-total cognitive impairment. They responded to gestures by imitation rather than comprehension. The final stage of a lineage repeating itself into extinction. In the cellar, the search team found one child, a girl of approximately 6 years, weak but breathing. She did not resist when lifted from the floor, only blinked against the brightness after years underground. Later testing would confirm her as a descendant of the Weller line, carrying traces of both Clara Finch and the inbred bloodline that had begun with Abram and Miriam Weller nearly 100 years earlier. Her name was recorded as Nora Finch. The official report listed the cause of death for the others as collective malnourishment and neglect. The structure was condemned and sealed within weeks. No attempts were made to preserve it. The valley was reclaimed by the forest within a season. With Nora's rescue, the record closed where it began. One surviving witness to a family that had turned inward until nothing remained. The dynasty that started as a search for purity ended as silence. A single child carried out from the dark, leaving behind a house that had devoured its own name. When Sheriff Edgar Tully returned to the Weller property with a full investigative team, the site was already decomposing under its own weight. Rain had seeped through the broken roof, softening floors and walls. The air inside was damp with decay, carrying the faint odor of long confinement. The team established a perimeter, marking each section of the structure with twine and numbered tags. Their task was not rescue now, but reconstruction, to piece together what had existed within those walls for nearly 100 years. Photographers moved room to room, documenting each level before removal began. The building was not a single house, but layers of habitation. One generation built atop another, creating a labyrinth that twisted back upon itself. Stairways led to sealed doors, these opened into crawl spaces, and corridors ended abruptly in solid timber. The layout appeared accidental yet deliberate, as if expansion had followed instinct rather than plan. In total, 32 chambers were identified, some connected only through small tunnels burrowed between floors. Human remains were recovered throughout the structure. Some skeletons were found in shallow pits under the floorboards, others arranged in groups along the cellar wall. The state medical examiner noted distinct physical uniformity across all specimens: narrow skulls, elongated limbs, and degenerative bone structure consistent with generations of close inbreeding. Each set of remains was catalogued, photographed, and transferred to the county morgue for further analysis. Among the debris, deputies uncovered hundreds of documents, ledgers, fragments of cloth-bound notebooks, and loose pages that had been kept dry inside tin containers. The earliest journals dated back to Abram Weller, their handwriting meticulous and ordered. Later volumes grew erratic, language collapsing into shorthand, then symbols. The continuity of these writings established an unbroken record from the 1870s through the 1950s. A century of self-contained existence documented entirely from within. The investigators mapped every item to its origin room. A single wall in the main chamber bore carvings that corresponded to notations in the journals, repeating initials, mirrored letters, and a spiral symbol appearing across multiple generations of text. These were recorded, sketched, and sent to the State Historical Office for preservation. No external correspondence or material linked the family to the outside world after 1890. Even the tools and utensils found on site were handmade, shaped from scavenged metal and bone. Medical reports concluded that the family's decline was inevitable. Generations of interrelation had produced irreversible physical and neurological degeneration. Nutrition deficiencies coupled with isolation accelerated the collapse. Investigators ruled out deliberate harm. What had occurred was gradual. A biological and cultural implosion carried forward by inheritance alone. When the report was finalized, Sheriff Tully noted in the margin of his logbook, "No intrusion, no outside cause." They ended where they began. The evidence supported his observation. From Abram and Miriam Weller in the mid-19th century to the final survivors found in 1957, the lineage had never been interrupted. For nearly 100 years, a single family had lived, multiplied, and vanished within the boundaries of one forgotten valley. A century-long continuity preserved by its own confinement. When the recovered materials from the Weller homestead were laid out in the county records room, the sheer volume surprised investigators. There were over 200 journals, notebooks, and loose pages, most waterlogged, others brittle with age. Each had been carefully stored in boxes lined with animal hide or waxed paper, evidence that the family valued their written record above anything else. It was through these pages, more than the physical remains, that their slow descent could be traced. The earliest volumes, attributed to Abram Weller, read like agricultural and genealogical ledgers. His handwriting was disciplined, each entry dated and structured. He recorded births, yields, weather, and behavior of livestock with the precision of a scientist. At first, nothing appeared unusual. Simple documentation of a man sustaining his household in isolation. Over time, however, the tone shifted. Abram's references to the blood made clean and the line preserved became more frequent. His vocabulary narrowed, circling the same terms: order, likeness, chosen, continuation. What had begun as bookkeeping had turned into liturgy. The next identifiable hand is Silas Weller's, beginning shortly after Abram's death. His script is heavier, the grammar fractured as if written by someone imitating instruction rather than thinking in language. Phrases appear unfinished, sometimes copied directly from Abram's earlier passages. The phrase "the chosen" recurs throughout, a term Silas used to describe not individuals, but the family as a single, sanctified organism. By this point, writing had become ritual. Sentences were repeated without variation, as though their meaning lay not in the words, but in the act of inscription itself. The deterioration continued across generations. The writings of Silas's children lose syntax entirely. Letters merge into shapes, margins fill with spirals and concentric circles. Some pages display sequences of what appear to be eyes, drawn again and again in precise alignment. Analysts would later interpret these as a primitive genealogy, each circle representing birth, each line descent. Whether symbolic or compulsive, the repetition suggests that writing had ceased to serve communication. It had become an internal practice, a way to maintain structure as everything else decayed. By the 1930s, the journals were nearly unreadable. Sentences gave way to drawings of faces and bodies, duplicated with minute differences. One section depicts figures arranged in a ring, all holding hands, surrounded by a single continuous line. Another shows a sequence of tall shapes, possibly trees or towers, with smaller human forms clustered beneath. The imagery remained consistent. Circular patterns, symmetry, reflection. Each page echoed the one before it, mirroring the genetic and behavioral repetition of the family itself. The final entries, dated no later than the early 1950s, are written in a hand too degraded to identify. They contain no words, only marks carved deep into the paper as though pressed with the tip of a nail. The pattern remains identical to the spirals that first appeared during Silas's lifetime. When scholars later examined the collection, they reached a single conclusion. These writings charted the transformation of isolation into belief. The Wellers no longer used language to describe their world. They used it to replace it. In solitude, their faith had turned inward until communication itself became sacred. The journals were not messages for the outside. They were the sound of a family speaking only to itself. When investigators entered the lowest level of the Weller homestead, they found a single door sealed with wooden beams. Behind it, in a narrow room lined with stone, sat a child. She was crouched beside a broken lantern, her clothing torn and blackened with soot. The girl appeared no older than 6. She did not cry or resist when lifted from the floor, only blinked at the light, her eyes adjusting slowly after years in darkness. Her name, discovered later through testing, was Nora Finch. Medical reports describe her condition with precision, but little interpretation. She weighed just over 40 pounds and showed evidence of long-term malnutrition. Her skin was pale to the point of translucence, veins visible beneath the surface. The distinctive grey-green eyes matched those found in photographs of the Wellers from decades earlier. Examination revealed no major injury, but her development lagged significantly behind her apparent age. She made no verbal sounds during the first 48 hours after recovery, responding only through small deliberate motions, turning her head towards sound, repeating hand movements shown by the nurses attending her. At the regional hospital, communication trials were conducted under supervision. When spoken to directly, Nora echoed gestures rather than words, imitating tone and rhythm without comprehension. Clicking noises were noted, short, patterned, bursts that matched descriptions made by Clara Finch years earlier. Specialists recorded these sounds, later confirming their cadence resembled the same rhythmic structure documented in the Weller journals. It was unclear whether the clicking served as language, instinct, or mimicry. DNA testing, performed using early comparative techniques, linked Nora to both Clara Finch and the Weller bloodline. The match established that Clara's sister, Nora Finch Sr., had entered the valley in 1949 and produced a child within the family before her disappearance. The finding connected the Wellers' century-long isolation to the outside world by a single fragile thread, one that had since closed again. The report's conclusion read, "Subject represents the final genetic continuity of the Weller lineage." For several months, Nora remained under observation. Her diet was stabilized, and she began to respond to human presence through imitation. No direct speech ever emerged. Drawings made by the child during her stay, mostly circular figures linked by lines, mirrored the imagery found throughout the recovered journals. Physicians noted the resemblance, but did not publish their findings. Requests for further study were denied. By the end of 1958, all references to her case were transferred to sealed medical archives. Her disappearance from record followed quietly. Hospital staff recalled that she was removed one night by state officials under orders of protective custody. No documentation lists where she was taken. Subsequent searches found no trace, no school records, no death certificate, no adoption file. The last surviving descendant of Abram and Miriam Weller, the child who had carried both lines in her blood, vanished as silently as she had been found. In official reports, the case of the Wellers closed that same year. The property was condemned, the remains interred anonymously, and the files marked complete. Yet the single surviving witness, a girl unable to speak, whose gestures echoed a forgotten language, ensured the story did not end. She became the living boundary between a family's extinction and its memory, then disappeared beyond both. The discovery of the Weller family reached the public in brief, inconsistent fragments. The first article appeared in the Redford County Gazette on June 2, 1957, under the headline, "Family of Hermits Found in Appalachian Valley." The report contained few details, and only that several people had been recovered from a neglected estate, with one child receiving medical attention. Within 2 days, larger newspapers reprinted the story with minor embellishments, calling it a case of rural madness or religious seclusion. None identified the location or mentioned the family's name. The official response was cautious. The county coroner's statement referred to an extended instance of mental and social deterioration brought about by voluntary withdrawal. The phrasing avoided terms like inbreeding or genetic decline. Public health officials emphasized that no contagious disease had been found and assured residents that the situation posed no community threat. The tone of the announcement shifted the story from horror to oddity, a curiosity that could be dismissed as an isolated anomaly. Photographs taken by Sheriff Edgar Tully's team were submitted to the State Historical Office but never released. The same applied to the forensic reports and the transcribed journals. Within a month, the files were reclassified under a sealed archive order marked "Restricted," subject of ongoing research. When the Louisville Courier attempted to obtain copies, their request was denied on grounds of privacy of surviving parties. After that, coverage ceased entirely. The story vanished from print as quickly as it appeared. Unofficial rumors persisted. Residents in neighboring towns claimed other settlements existed deep within the same valley system. Smaller groups sharing the Weller surname or similar genetic features. No verification followed. A brief, state-led survey conducted in 1958 found no additional dwellings, though records show that several tracts of land nearby were quietly purchased by private entities shortly after. The buyers' identities were withheld. Over time, the incident became a footnote in local memory. When the property's ownership came under dispute in the 1960s, court filings listed the land as abandoned with no legal heirs. Plans for redevelopment stalled amid conflicting claims and the region's poor accessibility. Eventually, the surrounding forest reclaimed the valley. The road leading to the site eroded into a footpath, and by the early 1970s, the exact location of the Weller house was no longer visible on maps. The State Archive retained the original boxes of evidence, journals, photographs, skeletal reports, in long-term storage, catalogued but inaccessible. Researchers attempting to locate the materials in later decades encountered missing file numbers and mislabeled entries. The case was effectively buried under procedural oversight. By the time the sheriff's office digitized its records in the 1990s, only a single reference to the event remained, a line in the county index reading, "Unidentified family, 1957, closed." The rest had been lost to reclassification or deliberate omission. The valley itself, overgrown and uninhabited, passed quietly into state possession. No marker identifies the ground where the house once stood. What began as front-page curiosity faded into paperwork and then into silence, a story reduced to a handful of inaccessible files and a landscape that remembers nothing. In the years that followed the investigation, the Weller property sank back into the earth that had once sustained it. Timber collapsed, foundations gave way, and the creek that ran beside the house shifted its path, carrying soil and debris across what remained of the walls. By the early 1960s, the structure was gone. Trees grew where the rooms had stood, their roots threading through floorboards buried beneath decades of runoff. From the road above the valley, no sign of habitation was visible, only a dense patch of forest indistinguishable from the rest of the hillside. Sheriff Edgar Tully retired not long after the case closed. He left behind a private notebook, discovered years later among county archives, containing a single reflective line. A century-long mirror that looked back at itself until there was nothing left to see. Beyond that, he never spoke publicly about the Wellers again. Those who worked with him recalled that he kept the photographs sealed in a metal drawer, reluctant to revisit them. The collected evidence, the journals, skeletal reports, and personal effects was transferred to state custody in 1961. The boxes were numbered, catalogued, and placed in long-term storage. None were ever displayed or made available for public review. Over time, references to the case in official records diminished until only inventory tags remained, each one labeled simply Weller Collection, Restricted. Researchers revisited the materials periodically through the 1970s and 1980s. Their findings were academic, stripped of any lingering sense of horror. The case appeared in psychology journals and anthropology courses as an example of social collapse under total isolation. The details that had once provoked fascination, the lineage, the mutations, the sealed valley, became data points cited without context. The family that had built its existence around purity was reduced to graphs and margins, the human element erased by analysis. The final trace of Nora Finch, the lone survivor, appeared in a state census record dated 1962. After that, her name vanished completely. No later identification matches the DNA or hospital files. Some believe she was transferred to a private institution. Others assume she died in custody and was buried without documentation. Neither theory has been proven. Whatever her fate, she carried the last thread of the Weller name, and with her, it disappeared. By the late 20th century, the valley was reclaimed in full. The access road was removed from public maps, listed as non-maintained. Only fragments of stone foundation and rusted implements remain scattered through the undergrowth. Locals who pass through the region rarely know what once stood there. To them, it is simply another forgotten hollow among hundreds. The Wellers left no heirs, no living memory. Only their records stored out of sight, ensuring that erasure could never be absolute. What began as a family's conviction became a closed circle of history, self-contained, repeating, and complete. In the end, the story returns to silence, a name remembered only by those who recorded its extinction, and a house that now exists only as part of the forest floor. Officially, the Weller case is closed. The site condemned, the evidence sealed, and the survivor never found. But closure doesn't erase history, it only buries it deeper. You've just heard everything the files would allow. The rest was lost in the silence of a single house. If you've made it this far, write your location and what time is it over there in the comments down below, so that every viewer becomes part of the ongoing record. Subscribe and leave a like to help preserve stories like this, fragments of history which were never meant to resurface.